The papal conclave that begins today will be the largest in modern history and likely the least predictable in decades. Its composition would also mirror a diverse range of perspectives within the Catholic Church, with Pope Francis leaving a legacy of giving a voice to the underrepresented. Now, all 133 electors will participate in the conclave despite exceeding the 120 cap set in the 1970s. And the Vatican said Pope Francis was deemed to have dispensed with the statutory limit. 108 of these electors, or 80%, were appointed by Pope Francis. That means an outsized number will be voting for the first time. That also means Francis's diverse appointments to the most senior clergy will be the majority setting the course for the church. The pontiff, known as a Pope of the Peripheries, created 163 cardinals from 76 countries. More than 20 of those had never been represented in the College of Cardinals before, including Singapore, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste in Asia. The Francis's picks have also tilted the leadership structure of the Roman Catholic Church away from its historic European base and more towards the global south. In 2013, more than half of the cardinal electors were Europeans. Now they represent just 40% of the vote. This conclave will see the rise of Asian and African cardinals. Asia Pacific will have the biggest increase in representation at this year's conclave, to 18% from just 10% in 2013. But Vatican observers say this does not mean that another reformer like Francis will succeed in the chair of St. Peter. The late Pope's election is said to be proof that political frameworks do not apply to papal elections. In 2013, conclave had a large conservative majority, but electors ended up selecting one of the most progressive cardinals to the papacy. And for more, we are joined by Piotr H Kosicki. He's an associate professor of history at University of Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Let's start inside the Sistine Chapel. Now, this is one of the most secretive and tradition-bound events in the modern world. How does a candidate actually get noticed, let alone chosen, in a papal conclave?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It starts well before the conclave, and we've had a long run up with Francis's illness in the last few months, but more generally over the past year or so, there's been a lot of contestation ever since it became really clear that the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI had not been extinguished. After all, the last pope died less than 3 years ago.
Yeah, indeed. Professor, so walk us through the key questions that cardinals will be weighing. Are there factors that make this one uniquely different from the past elections?
Uh, this is, as you've pointed out, the largest gathering in modern history. Going over 120 cardinals is unheard of. And the factors that count are going to be how much of a pastor someone has been in the past, how identified directly a given cardinal was with Pope Francis as opposed to Pope Benedict. Some of the names that have appeared on the famous list of the papabili, or the Pope qualifying candidates, are folks who were very close intellectually to Pope Benedict XVI. Some are insiders from the Roman Curia. Especially the Italians are figures understood as being very much heralding centrist positions, heralding dialogue. There's a question of age, not to be under the age of 70 because maybe that's too young. There's also a question of attitudes toward very specific issues, whether it's reform with respect to the sex abuse scandals that the church has been experiencing for years, whether it has to do with the finances of Rome, whether it has to do with more generally the role that Europe will continue to play, that Italy will continue to play in the church as opposed to Asia or South America or Africa.
We'll get to the demographics in a bit, but Professor, many viewers remember films like The Conclave, where they show intense factional battles between the progressives and conservatives. Just how accurate is that portrayal today?
Well, it's hard to say without being in the room, but the film is surprisingly accurate in a lot of respects, I think. From my taste, it's over the top. It has a flair for the melodrama, but of course, that's to be expected from a major motion picture. On the other hand, the long-standing division between progressives and conservatives, really, it goes back at least to the 1960s, to the Second Vatican Council. The legacy of the Second Vatican Council, some of the basic reforms, including delivering homilies in the vernacular languages, right? The move away from the Latin Mass, those are very contested. The idea that the laity and that lower clergy should have a voice, should be a deciding factor in how the church is governed. Pope Francis was very, very adamant when it came to something called synods, that synodality, that regular Catholics should be able to participate in how the church is governed. That is something that we actually really, in some ways, have yet to see whether it's going to be a lasting legacy or not. It will depend on the attitude, reformist or not, conservative or not, and also open toward pastoral life, toward what's going on in the day-to-day lives of the faithful, the role of women, the role of divorced Catholics, the role of LGBT. These are all on the table, and Francis opened a lot of questions, but closed almost none of them.
Okay. So, Professor, let's talk demographics. The popes have historically come from Europe, yet the growth of the Catholic Church is happening elsewhere, in Africa and Asia in particular. Given that, is it time for the next pope to come from the global south?
I think that this is a really, really serious point that the cardinals have to take under consideration. The growth areas of the church, and this isn't recent, for a long time, have been outside the European continent. The question fundamentally is whether Europe should continue to play a guiding role in the Catholic Church. And by Europe, in all likelihood, of course, there are non-Italian serious contenders. One of the serious contenders comes from Hungary, another comes from France, but fundamentally, the Italians are probably the most serious European contenders. They're also the nationality that probably would be most widely understood and acknowledged if we don't end up with a cardinal from a different part of the world. But fundamentally, every part of the world has its own regional interests, has its own traditions. African cardinals are going to be much more conservative than most South American cardinals. Asian cardinals are also incredibly diverse in terms of their stance, even those who were appointed by Pope Francis. And I did want to say, as a last point, that even though Pope Francis appointed a lot of non-Europeans, they don't necessarily agree with one another. So in that sense, just because someone comes from Africa or Asia doesn't mean they'll be more progressive or more conservative than a particular European.
That's interesting. But if there is a shift, let's say, and a pope from Asia or Africa is selected, what sort of real, tangible changes might follow? I mean, could there be energy in mission work or where the Vatican resources go to, or a different approach to how bishops are appointed? What do you think?
Well, the questions that I mentioned earlier that Francis opened regarding who actually participates and who governs in the church are absolutely central here. If we move away from Rome, if we move away from a European papacy, then it's absolutely necessary to start populating the Roman Curia with more non-Europeans. Not there are already quite a few non-Europeans in there, but there will be a crew that comes along with whatever locality or nationality or region produced the new cardinal who's chosen to be the new pope. That being said, of course, there's a matter of resources, but at the end of the day, the question of priority of pastorship, where the growth areas of the world are understood to be and where they should be for the purposes of the future of the church. Because this, I have to say, fundamentally remains an open question. How long will the Catholic Church maintain its distinctiveness in the global marketplace of religions? Because it competes with evangelical Christianity, it competes with Islam, it competes with Buddhism, and so on and so forth. And so that competition and the need to develop mission further, as you pointed out, is going to be absolutely on the minds of all of the cardinals voting, even if they end up voting for a European.
Okay, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Piotr H Kosicki, Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. Thank you.